This is Gemara's Zevachim Daf Lamid, the Daf of 4 Shemini Atzeres here in Chutz Laaretz, Shemini Atzeres and Simchas Torah in Eretz Yisrael, a day of Simchas HaTorah. On such a day, we like all the Torah to be an incredible Schos Refuah Shalema for Gabriel Simcha ben Miri Mahuva. The ultimate Koyach HaTorah should bring a Refuah Shalema B'Karev. We're holding 4 lines from the bottom on Chavtesim and Beis, and we just had a Mishnah, a machlekes in the Mishnah between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. A Mishnah that was a Klal, and Rabbi Yehuda, will just quote the words of Rabbi Yehuda who said, Kol shemachshavas ha-zman, kol shemachshavas ha-makam pegol v'chavlav karis. But machshavas ha-makam, because machshavas ha-zman, then is named by karis. So Rabbi Yehuda said it's totally which one comes first. The Chachamim said no, neither of those have karis. Says the Gemara, Omar Ilfa. Machlekes. This machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, b'shtei avodos. The machlekes is when the two kavanais, the two machshavos, I should say, he had during 2 different avodos. Avo ba'avodah achas tivrei kol eira machshavos have. But if it was during one avodah, then everyone agrees that there's an eruv, a mixture, a mingle, a combination of machshavos. Therefore, there'll be no pegel. That's how Ilfa learns. Rav Yechanan Amar, no, af avodah achas machlekes. Even during one avodah, we would still have a machlekes. So machlekes, Ilfa and Rav Yechanan, how far the machlekes Chachamim and Rav Yehuda goes. So says the Gemara, the way that Ilfa learns the Mishnah, we can versteh, we understand. The first half of the Mishnah was Shtei Avodos, the second half of the Mishnah is Shtei Avodos. And Rashi over here fills in the blanks, 2 lines at the bottom, and teaches us that in the Reisha was the Katani Behedya. The Reisha said explicitly it was Shtei Avodos. So according to Ilfa, we understand the way he's teaching up the Mishnah. But says the Gemara, says the Gemara, El Rav Yechanan Reisha, Shtei Avodos, V'seifa b'avodah achas. Says the Gemara, what is going on according to Rav Yechanan? Is it conceivable that the Mishnah has such a discrepancy? And the Gemara answers, well, yes, don't get so bothered. As we turn over to today's daf, the Falamid responds the Gemara indeed, Reisha b'shtei avodos, seifa, bein b'avodah achas, bein b'shtei avodos, and therefore, it's no kasha on Rav Yechanan. Continues the Gemara on the second line. So we started with a kasha on Rav Yechanan, and the Gemara continues with a kasha on Ilfa. Tinan, we learned in a Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda zeh haklal, if machshavas hazman kodem machshavas hamakoim, if the machshava of zman comes before the machshava of makoim, says Rabbi Yehuda, pick up chavel of kares. So bishlam, the way the Rabbi Yechanan is understanding, Hainditan is aklal, Elfa my zaklal. According to Elfa, what is the purpose? What is the zaklal? Explains the Gemara, because according to Elfa, it's only referring to such a case of shtei machshavos during 2 different avodos. So it's a very specific case. A klal means it applies everywhere. Says the Gemara, indeed, kasha, this is shver on Ilfa. Continues the Gemara Tanan, also on 5 lines down, the 2 dots, Lamed Amid Aleph, Harezo, Tumuras Ayla, Timuras Shlamim. If someone says this animal is substitute as a Timura, as a substitute for my Ayla or my Shlamim, Harezu Timuras Ayla. He said both. He said the animal is a Timura for my Shlamim and I should say clearly, he didn't say and. He just said it is a Timura for my Shlamim, it is a Timura for my Ayla. So the question clearly is, we don't know exactly what he meant. So says the Gemara, it's a Tamura for the Oila Divri Rabbi Meir. Amar Rabbi Yosi, Im Lekach Niskavein, says Rabbi Yosi, Im Lekach Niskavein Techila. If this was his Kavana, Hayel V'yav Sherloitzi Shtei Shemas Kachas. You can't say two things simultaneously. It's impossible to say Oila and Shlam at the same moment. Therefore, Tvarav Kayamim Ve'im Mishamar. However, if he says Harezu Tmuras Oila, this is in Oila, V'nimlach, and then he thinks and he reconsiders, says no, V'amar Harezu Tmuras Shlamim, then Harezu Oila. Then his first kavana applies. Meaning, if it's clear he's saying both, you just can't say them simultaneously. Then says Gemara Nachanami, then the halacha is going to be that Tavarav Kayamim, it's going to be an Oila and a Shlamim. If not, it's going to be an Oila. So Ibaylo asks the Gemara, Harezu Tmuras Oila u Shlamim. If he said it's, and this is why it was so important, when we spoke about the case at first, we are precise in the exact way he said it. Because now he says, Klar, this is the Tamura of an Oila and a Shlamim. He didn't say Tamuras Oila, Tamura Shlamim. He said Tamuras Oila u Shlamim. Mahu, what is the halacha in this case? Or case number 2, Lachatzois, if he said let it be half. Mahu, what's the halacha? Amar Abaya, Bavaida, Moidi Rameir, in this case Rameir is maskim that both will take effect. Rav Amar, no, Adayin Himachlikis. Amar Rava LaAbaye, says Rava LaAbaye Ladidach Amar Bavade Moidi Rameir. You said that Rameir certainly agrees in this case that it's going to be both an Oila and a Shlamim. Hare, so as Rava Ta'abaya Shchita D'Lechi Chatzois Dami, says Rava, in the case of Shchita, when he shechs an animal and he has Kavanas Chutz L'Zman and Chutz L'Mekaymai, which is a case D'Lechi Chatzois Dami, it's as if he said it should be in half, and yet, Upligi, yet the Tanai and the Mishnah argue over whether it's both or one. So why are you saying in such a scenario everyone would admit? Amar Le responds Abaya mi savris ina l'shchita ela l'bsaif. Do you think that the shchita only is chal at the end? No. Yesh the shchita mitchila v'atzaif. The shchita is one long act, and therefore Mishnah seinu da'amar. What is the case in the Mishnah? He said, Simin rishon chutz l'zmanoi. Simin sheni chutz l'mekaymai. There's 2 simanim that has to be severed in the animal during the shchita process. So the case is that he split the shchita in half. And that's why it's not so pashut, because he's not saying both simultaneously. Says Gemara, but wait, Kemitza, what about the case of Kemitza, that he has both kavanais? And that's clear, and yet upligi. Says Abaye, no, Sanami, Sheikh their kaimetz minchal chutz l'zmanoi. Kaimetz levana chutz l'mekaymai. He did each kaimetz with a different kavana. Asked the Gemara further, kaimetz the minchas chayta. What about the Kemitza of minchas chayta? Delchi Levaina Bahadei. With the Leka Levaina Bahadei, excuse me, there's no Levaina, meaning it's just the Kemitza, just his fistful, the 3 fingers full of the Minchas Chayta, and yet Upligi, and clearly there were 2 Kavanais. So what do we see? We see that they could both be within one Avaida. Says the Gemara, Loi Pligi. Says Abai, guess what? I argue with you. They don't argue in this case. I'm sticking to my Yisoy that they'll be maskim in such a scenario. Amar Rav Ashi, another Teret, 7 lines to the bottom. Imtim Slimar Pligi. Pligi, Bipsiyos, they argue with regard to steps, that when they brought the Kemitza, again, we could split up the Kemitza in different halves of the Avoida. Rav Sim Bar Ashi, Mastik Abai, Ravuna Bar Nasa, Mastik Rava. Each has their shita supporting them. Different Tanoim that hold like they said. Continues the Gemara, Ki Asar Avdimi, 4 lines to the bottom, Amar Rameir. Bishitas Rabbi Yehuda Amra. Rameir said his shita according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Damar Tfais Lashain Rishain. Like Rabbi Yehuda, who said grab hold of the first lashon and say that it's the ikar. Titanan. Rav Yehuda Zakal Machshavas Azman Kodmas Machshavas Makom, as he said in the Mishnah. Then what? Peg of a chavel of kares, because the first machshava was machshavas zman, and that creates full-fledged pegol. Amar le Abaye, as we turn over to Lamina Bebeis, responds Abaye 1 second. V'ho Rav Chana, Amar Rav Yechanan, but when Rav Chana was ki magas leo Rameir, v'Rav Yaisi b'adei adadi, v'loi pligi. Rav Yechon, he said that if you want to join together Magas, Lahu, the opinions are Rameir and Rav Yaisi, Loi Pligi, then they're not going to argue. They're very similar. Both are going to agree that we don't go with the first Lashon. We don't say Tvais Lashon Rishon. So how are you saying that? Says more for Loi Pligi. Vamif like Pligi. What are you talking about? Rameir and Rav Yaisi do argue. Amrlei Pligi b'maide Pligi. So Abaye says you're right. They argue where they argue, but v'loi pligi, b'mai deloi pligi. But in any case, they did not explicitly argue. They did not. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yechon, I call maide heicha da Amar techol zu. In a case, Rameir and Yosef agree. In a case where one set, let this one, let it be an oila take effect, and then ve'achar kach techol zu. 8 lines down, Lamed Beis, Devarakol loy chaylo. Everyone agrees in such a case that the latter, that which he did when he said that Shviyah Shlamim doesn't work. Loy techalzu ella imkein chalazu. He said this should not be chal unless that is chal. Devarakol chaylo it is. Ki pligi, what's the machlekes? Tamar tmuras oila tmuras shlamim. The case of machlekes is our case. We said this cryptic lashon. It should be a tmuras oila, and then he continues that it should be a tmuras shlamim. So in this scenario, Rameir tmuras oila shlamim. That's what he should have said if you want it to be both. And he didn't, and rather he said v'amar tmuras oila tmuras shlamim. So Rameir says the fact that if he wanted both to be chal, he should have said tmuras oila shlamim. And he didn't. Therefore, that shows us, that proves to us he's being chayzer. But Rav Yaisi says, no, I would have thought I would have thought it's half and half. So therefore, why did he say that? Says Rav Yaisi, not to be chayzer, but rather maybe the kula ayla, the kula shlamim hava. He was trying to indicate that they should be both an ayla and both fully a shlamim, and that's where Rav Yaisi disagrees. But what do we see over here? We see that Rameir is being maskim, that if he says tumuras ayla shlamim, then both would take effect. He's agreeing with Rav Yaisi that we don't say tvais lashon rishon. So Amar Lei, so Rav Dimi responds to Abaya, who Amar Lei pligi. You're right. You're quoting Rabbi Rav Chana. He holds that Rameir and Rav Yaisi don't argue, but Vana. But Abaya, Amina, I say pligi, that indeed they do argue. And that concludes, we'll call it the second part of our shir of the day, which is whether we have a machlekes Rameir and Rav Yaisi or not. Amar Ula, so Ula picks it up, and Ula brings it back to our din in our Mishnah. Umar Ula v'tem Rav Oishia. Efshar yadin al chavrim babloi kizayis tanan or kizayis tanan. Do those in Babloi, my friends in Babylonia, do they know that the correct way of reading the Mishnah is it kizayis, and olive tomorrow and olive's worth outside, or kizayis, or is it with a vav? What is the appropriate way of reading the Mishnah? Says the Gemara, what's the shailo? Kzayis tanan, avol kzayis, if you threw in that extra vav, then what? Typically, your machshavas havi will be a mixture of both. Really, you said both, and according to Rav Yehuda, it's two separate expressions. V'kolshkein ksayis. So the Gemara is clearing, says Ula, what is pshat in the Mishnah? Tashima, 10 lines on the wide lines and Lamed Amid Beis. The first one line is ksayis. Levi asks Rabbi, If you had intent to eat a ksais tomorrow, shalobim come in the wrong place. What's the halacha according to Rabbi Yehuda? Amarle Rabbi responds, Zu sheila is eir machshavas havai. Zu sheila, this is a great question. Eir machshava havai. The answer is that what? It is an eir machshava. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there would be no pigul. Amar lefan of Rav Shimon Rebbe. So Rav Shimon Rebbe says to Rebbe, Loi Mishnah Seini, 1 second. Is this not our Mishnah? What did the Mishnah say? Lech l'kzayis b'chotz, kzayis l'machar, kzayis l'machar, kzayis b'chotz. Kechatzi zayis b'chotz, kechatzi zayis l'machar, kechatzi zayis l'machar, kechatzi zayis b'chotz. In all of these cases, pasal ve'ein b'ay kares. Klar in the Mishnah. Ha'idach, but in the other cases, Ir Machshavas Havai. It will clearly be an Ir Machshavas even according to Rabbi Yehuda, and there'll be no pigul. So why are you saying to Levi, wow, Zu Sheila, what a question. What do you mean this is klar in our Mishnah? So Amar Le, Rabbi responds, 3 lines from the white lines, Hu Shoel Bidvar Chachma. He asked a kasha based on the way that he learned the Mishnah, but he was taught the Mishnah. But Amrit Mishnah Seinu, based on what I taught you, Ledi Daktas Nitzcha Tarti Lekashlcha. Meaning, you're right. If you have your gears on the Mishnah, then it's no kasha. And then you're right. That's how I taught you the Mishnah. But Levi didn't have that girsa. The day Delayis Naya, he didn't have what? Rather Elachada. He only had one. Vishaminan. The Rabbanan, the Kagarsi Tarti, and he heard the Rabbanan who were Gairis both, and that's where Levi came along to ask this kasha. V'savar, so Levi thought, di davka is the way that I was taught the Mishnah davka. V'did hu eir machshavas havei odemol ledu davka ledi shiri shi'ayr lei u'medi shi'ayr lei ledidi ashar lu ledu nami b'hach. It was also left out in their case. So says the Gemara, the reason he praises Levi's kasha, because without having it explicit in his Mishnah, Levi created it, came to the kasha on his own. Says the Gemara, V'hei yisnaya, lemaisa. What did Rebbe teach Levi? If he taught him kzayis ukizayis asnaye halav shiuru, then it certainly there's nothing left out. Ella rather kzayis asnaye avitibayale. And then Levi had a shayla, kzayis. What was his kasha? Savar yibai mine chada d'shamin entirety. I'll ask you one kasha, which is really 2. Dei b'ina kzayis hanicha iyamar li klala. Koshking kzayis l'machar b'chotz. Eli yamar li prata. Chati kzayis l'machar b'chotz kami bayilei. That would still be a good kasha. And yachi. Hashtanami. Now as well. Latin Amr le Kzayis Lamachar Bachotz Prata. Koshkin Kzayis Ukzayis. Ali Amr le Klala. Akati Kzayis Ukzayis Vibaile. Imkain what? Mertach Rotach. So Levi thought that Rebbe's going to get upset with me asking the kasha. We turn over to Lamed Alpha and Aleph. And he'll think Hashik Kzayis Ukzayis Klala. Kzayis Lamachar Bachotz Mibayi. And it was based on the fact that Levi did not have a klar Mishnah. That Levi was not taught that girsa. That's why Levi came up with the kasha. That's why his kasha was praised, because he was able to ask such a question. Pick it up from here, B'siyata Dishmai.